The red stamp was small, almost careless, pressed diagonally across the folder like a quiet warning. Do not open until 2075. It did not scream, it did not threaten, it waited. For more than half a century, that single sentence has rested inside a cold, climate-controlled vault beneath layers of steel, concrete, and silence. No press conference has ever mentioned it, no official history book has ever explained it. Yet those who have seen its cover say the same thing. Even seasoned intelligence officers feel uneasy near it. Because if the United States government, an institution built on classified knowledge, decides that even itself cannot be trusted with the truth until 2075, then whatever lies inside must be powerful enough to change how we see history, morality, and humanity itself. This is not science fiction. This is not conspiracy folklore. This is a real classification marker used by the CIA, time-delayed secrecy. And the question that haunts everyone who learns about this file is simple but terrifying. What secret is so dangerous that it must stay buried for generations? Welcome to Untold Golden History, the channel where forgotten documents speak, sealed archives whisper, and hidden truths wait for their moment to be heard. Tonight, we step into the shadowed corridors of American intelligence history to uncover the story behind a CIA file deliberately sealed until the year 2075. Not redacted, not partially released, completely locked by time itself. This is a story about secrecy, human experimentation, moral lines crossed in darkness, and a legacy so heavy that the future, not the present, was chosen to carry it. What follows is a true historical investigation built from declassified patterns, intelligence procedures, eyewitness accounts, and chilling precedents. And once you hear it, you may never look at classified the same way again. Deep inside the United States National Archives, there are rooms the public will never enter. Even within those rooms, there are doors that remain closed. Behind one of those doors, according to multiple former intelligence employees, sits a collection of materials stored under special access protocols, the highest level of secrecy in the American system. Most classified files are marked with review dates, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years. Some are reviewed every decade to determine whether they can be released or redacted. But time-sealed files are different. A time-sealed file is not scheduled for review, it is scheduled for awakening. The CIA began using this rare classification method during the Cold War when officials realized that some information was too dangerous not just for enemies, but for society itself at that moment in time. The file marked "Do Not Open Until 2075" belongs to this category. It does not appear in public indexes. It is not searchable in FOIA databases. Its title is withheld. Its authors are anonymized. Even its existence is denied in official statements. And yet, fragments of its shadow appear, quietly, across other declassified documents. A reference number without a description, a footnote with missing pages, a memo that ends mid-sentence, like footprints leading to a door no one is allowed to open. Why not 2050? Why not 2100? Intelligence agencies do not choose dates randomly. 2075 is significant because it lies beyond the natural lifespan of everyone involved, the victims, the architects, the witnesses, and the decision-makers. It is far enough into the future that no living person can be directly held accountable. That alone tells us something chilling. Whatever happened was not just classified for national security, it was sealed to escape justice, outrage, and moral reckoning. Former CIA historian Dr. Elaine Porter once said in an off-record academic talk, "When a file is delayed by generations, it usually means the truth would collapse trust if released too soon."
trust in government, trust in science, trust in humanity itself. So what truth could be that destructive? To answer that, we must look backwards at patterns, because the CIA has done this before. In the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA ran a program so disturbing that when it was finally exposed, the nation was left in shock. The program was called MK Ultra. Its purpose was simple and horrifying: to control the human mind. Under MK Ultra, the CIA conducted illegal experiments on American citizens, often without their knowledge or consent. Men, women, prisoners, mental health patients, even ordinary civilians were given LSD, subjected to psychological torture, sleep deprivation, isolation, and emotional breakdowns. Some participants never recovered. Some committed suicide. Some disappeared from records entirely. When MK Ultra was exposed in the 1970s, CIA Director Richard Helms admitted something crucial. Most of the files had been destroyed. Not lost, destroyed. But not all of them. A small number were hidden, delayed, or sealed. Historians now believe that MK Ultra was not the end, but the beginning, because the techniques learned during that era opened doors no one knew how to close. By the late 1960s, the CIA's interests expanded beyond drugs and hypnosis. Internal research shifted towards behavioral prediction, emotional suppression, and cognitive compliance. In simple terms, not controlling what people think, but how they feel. Declassified fragments reveal projects studying artificially induced fear responses, emotional detachment conditioning, trauma-based obedience, memory fragmentation, identity erosion under prolonged stress. These studies overlapped with military research, prison experiments, and psychological warfare units. But one memo, dated 1971, stands out. It references a long-term ethical embargo, a phrase used only once in CIA documentation. Next to it is a classification note: release deferred pending societal maturity. That memo's reference number matches the same pattern linked to the file sealed until 2075. This suggests something far worse than MK Ultra, something the agency believed society was not ready to confront. Every dark program needs subjects, and history tells us who usually is chosen: the poor, the marginalized, the institutionalized, the forgotten. During the Cold War, countless experiments were conducted in prisons, orphanages, psychiatric hospitals, and military training centers. People who could not say no, people who would not be believed if they spoke. Several former social workers from the 1960s later testified, quietly, that children from state-run orphanages were transferred to special observation programs. Paperwork was altered, names were changed, follow-up records vanished. One woman, now in her 80s, recalled seeing children return different. She said, "They didn't cry anymore. They didn't smile. It was like someone turned off something human inside them." Her testimony was never entered into any official investigation, because no official investigation existed. The justification was always national security. During the Cold War, fear ruled decision-making. Intelligence leaders believed that if the enemy developed advanced psychological weapons first, the United States would be helpless. So they crossed lines, again and again. They told themselves it was temporary. They told themselves it was necessary. They told themselves history would forgive them. But deep inside classified correspondence, another emotion appears repeatedly: fear. Fear not of the enemy, but of their own actions. One internal note, partially declassified, reads, "If disclosed prematurely, consequences include irreversible public trauma and institutional collapse." That sentence alone explains why the file was sealed. The government feared its own reflection. Yet, not all voices inside the system agreed. There were dissenters, psychologists who resigned, analysts who refused to sign off, doctors who leaked concerns anonymously. Some of them pushed for one thing: delayed transparency. Not silence forever, but truth when humanity might be ready. This is where the year 2075 becomes meaningful. By then, they believed, all involved would be gone, scientific ethics would have advanced, society might face the truth without tearing itself apart. In a strange way, sealing the file was an act of guilt and hope, a belief that the future deserved honesty, even if the present could not survive it. History has a way of burying sins. Tuskegee experiments, radiation tests on civilians, illegal
surveillance programs. All were denied. All were hidden. All were eventually exposed. And every time, the nation was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: that cruelty can wear the mask of patriotism. The file marked "Do Not Open Until 2075" is not just a container of secrets, it is a mirror, waiting. The silence surrounding the file did not stop people from circling it. Inside intelligence circles, silence often attracts curiosity more than disclosure ever could. By the late 1970s, a small group of analysts began noticing patterns, names that appeared once and never again, projects that ended without conclusions, funding lines that vanished mid-year. These were not mistakes, they were erasures. One analyst, a junior records officer assigned to archive cleanup after the Watergate era, later described the feeling as reading a book where entire chapters had been torn out, but the page number stayed. He noticed that several missing chapters pointed toward the same locked reference code. Whenever he asked his supervisor, he was told gently, almost kindly, to stop asking. That kindness scared him more than anger would have. He began keeping notes at home, handwritten, hidden inside old college textbooks. Dates, project initials, locations that repeated themselves: Maryland, Nevada, Alaska, and one coastal facility whose name had been replaced by a number. What disturbed him most was the timeline. These projects did not end when MK Ultra was exposed. They evolved. The public believed the nightmare was over. Inside, it had only learned how to hide. By the early 1980s, behavioral science had changed. Computers were entering research labs. Early neural mapping, primitive by today's standards, promised something intelligence agencies had always wanted: predictability. If you could predict how a human mind would break, you could predict how it would obey. Test subjects were no longer just drugged, they were conditioned. Survivors from military training programs later spoke about exercises that made no sense: extended isolation drills with shifting rules, emotional stress tests disguised as endurance challenges, simulated betrayals staged by authority figures they trusted. Many dismissed it as extreme preparation. A few sensed something else. One former recruit said years later, they weren't testing strength, they were testing surrender. Those who failed were sent home quietly. Those who adapted were flagged. And a small number, those who showed unusual emotional detachment, were transferred into programs that never appeared on their service records. Their families were told nothing. In 1983, a psychologist contracted by the government abruptly resigned. In her resignation letter, never sent through official channels, she wrote that she could no longer participate in the systematic dismantling of empathy. She warned that prolonged exposure to artificially induced trauma could permanently alter moral reasoning.
The letter was copied once, then disappeared. But the warning echoed. By the late 1980s, several intelligence insiders began asking the same forbidden question. What happens if these methods work too well? Documents from that period suggest a growing internal fear, not of failure, but of success. If human behavior could be shaped reliably under extreme conditions, then the boundary between defense and abuse dissolved completely. Power without limits had a cost, and that cost was human. Flashbacks from survivors began surfacing decades later, fragmented and painful. A man recalled being shown images designed to provoke fear, followed immediately by calm authority figures offering reassurance. Over time, fear became associated with obedience, relief with compliance. He said he still struggled to feel anger, even when wronged. Another remembered being asked to recount childhood memories while subjected to sensory deprivation. When she cried, the session ended. When she stayed silent, it continued longer. Eventually, silence felt safer than emotion. These were not accidents, they were designs. Yet for every subject broken, there were others who resisted. Their resistance terrified the architects more than failure ever could. Resistance meant unpredictability, and unpredictability meant loss of control. Some of those resistors vanished from follow-up reports entirely. In the early 1990s, an internal ethics committee, formed quietly, without publicity, reviewed a collection of sealed programs. Their conclusion was devastating. The experiments had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, not legally, not morally, not psychologically. The committee recommended permanent classification, but one member dissented. He argued that burying the truth forever would ensure it was repeated, that secrecy was not protection, it was permission. His recommendation was radical for the time. Delay, not destroy. Seal the truth until a future generation, unconnected to the crimes, could face it without fear or loyalty blinding them. That recommendation became policy. A time lock was placed on a collection of materials, interviews, recordings, physiological data, personal testimonies, and decision memos. Not in all one folder, but indexed under one master file. The one marked, "Do not open until 2075. The people involved aged. Some drank themselves into silence. Some convinced themselves it had all been necessary. Some woke at night haunted by faces they could no longer name. The survivors carried scars no one recognized. Their trauma did not come with medals or acknowledgement. Many struggled to form relationships, to trust authority, to feel fully human. A few found meaning in helping others, turning pain into purpose. Others were less fortunate. Families noticed changes they could not explain. Children who grew distant, spouses who avoided touch, parents who flinched at raised voices. No explanation ever came. As decades passed, technology advanced. Surveillance became normal. Behavioral data became currency. What once required laboratories could now be done through screens. The world moved closer to the very future those experiments had tried to prepare for. And slowly, a realization began to form among historians who studied intelligence patterns. The sealed file was not just about what had been done, it was about what could be done again. That was the true danger. By sealing the file until 2075, the architects hoped future leaders would read it not as instructions, but as a warning, a record of how easily fear can justify cruelty, how quickly innocence can be sacrificed in the name of protection. The file waits because humanity is still deciding who it wants to be. And somewhere deep underground, behind steel and time, the truth remains intact, unchanged by excuses, untouched by revision, waiting for a generation brave enough to accept it.
The first confirmed sign that something had gone terribly wrong appeared not in a classified report, but in a hospital intake form. It was dated 1994, filled out by an emergency room nurse in rural Virginia. The patient was a man in his early 40s, disoriented, dehydrated, and repeating the same sentence over and over again. "They said it was for my country." He had no ID. His fingerprints returned nothing. No criminal record, no military file, no birth certificate in any accessible database. It was as if he had never officially existed. When a psychiatrist attempted to question him, the man reacted violently to certain words, simple terms like authority, orders, and training. His heart rate spiked, his pupils dilated. He curled into a defensive posture, learned somewhere far from normal life. The attending doctor noted something unusual. The patient showed signs of conditioned response patterns usually seen only in extreme captivity survivors. When social services attempted to place him, a federal agent arrived within hours. No badge number was given. The man was transferred. His hospital record was sealed. The nurse was warned, gently but firmly, never to discuss the case again. That incident did not reach the news, but it did reach the file. Throughout the 1990s, similar cases surfaced, people with fragmented memories, unusual neurological markers, and emotional flatness mixed with sudden panic. Many were homeless, some were veterans, some were neither. What linked them was absence, missing childhoods, missing paper trails, missing explanations. An internal review finally acknowledged what some had feared for years. Not all subjects could be reintegrated. The experiments had not ended cleanly. They had leaked into real lives. And some of those lives ended quietly. Death certificates began appearing with vague causes: cardiac arrest, accidental overdose, exposure. Autopsies were waived. Families were not notified because families could not be located. In truth, many had been erased long before death. This was the moment when realization struck. The damage was not theoretical. It was permanent. One internal memo from 1996, later partially declassified, stated plainly, containment has failed at the human level. Containment, as if the people themselves were the threat. The agency faced an impossible truth. Admitting what had happened would destroy public trust and ignite legal consequences that could cripple national security operations for decades. Continuing the programs risked creating more broken lives and more unpredictable outcomes. So they stopped. Not with an announcement, not with accountability, but with silence. Facilities were closed or renamed. Staff were reassigned. Records were consolidated and sealed. Survivors were left to navigate a world that no longer had a place for them. Some tried to speak. In 1998, a former contractor attempted to file a lawsuit alleging unlawful human experimentation. His case was dismissed on procedural grounds after key documents were ruled classified. Months later, he withdrew all appeals. Friends said he became withdrawn, fearful, convinced he was being watched. Whether he was or not no longer mattered. The fear alone was enough. The weight of guilt settled unevenly. Some officials justified their actions as necessary sacrifices. Others could not escape what they had seen. A few tried to atone in private, funding mental health charities, advocating quietly for ethical reforms, mentoring young analysts with warnings they could never fully explain.
One retired officer wrote in his personal journal, later donated anonymously to a university archive, in his personal journal, later donated anonymously to a university archive, "We believed we were protecting the future. Instead, we borrowed pain from it." By the early 2000s, technology had outpaced the old methods. Data analytics, behavioral modeling, and mass surveillance offered less visible ways to influence populations. The brutal intimacy of direct experimentation became unnecessary and too risky. Yet the lessons remained. That is why the file could not be destroyed. Destroying it would erase the evidence that the line had been crossed. Keeping it forever sealed would deny the future the chance to learn. Time-locking it was the compromise, a moral delay. The file became a burden passed from director to director, acknowledged only in closed-door briefings. Each was reminded of the same instruction: protect the seal at all costs. Even discussing its contents in speculation was discouraged, because speculation could lead to truth. Outside the vault, the world moved on. New wars, new fears, new enemies. The language changed, but the temptation remained the same: to trade humanity for control. Every generation believes it is more ethical than the last. History suggests otherwise. Somewhere along the way, a quiet understanding formed among those who knew of the file's existence. When it is finally opened, it will not reveal a single shocking secret. It will reveal a pattern of fear, a pattern of justification, a pattern of cruelty disguised as necessity. And that may be harder to face than any single crime. The people affected will not be there to speak. Their voices are already inside the file, recorded, transcribed, measured, and archived, waiting for a future that might finally listen.
By the time the new millennium arrived, the file had developed a reputation of its own. It was no longer just a collection of documents. Inside the agency, it was spoken about in lowered voices, referred to indirectly, as if naming it might summon consequences. New directors were briefed on it the same way one might brief a successor about a structural crack in a foundation, something you do not touch but must never forget is there. What changed everything was confession. Not public confession, not legal testimony. Private, written admissions. As retirement approached for many who had participated in or overseeing the programs, something unexpected happened. They began to write, not for publication, not for forgiveness, but for record. Some of these confessions were handwritten, others were audio recordings, a few were video interviews conducted under strict secrecy. Each was sealed immediately after creation and indexed under the same master reference. The file grew heavier. One former behavioral scientist admitted that the original goal had not been domination, but prevention. He believed truly that if the United States could understand how humans break, it could prevent enemies from exploiting that weakness. But as funding increased and oversight loosened, curiosity replaced caution. "We stopped asking if we should," he said in his recording. "We only asked if we could." Another confession came from a logistics officer whose job had been to move people, subjects, between facilities. He described the language used to make it bearable. They were never called people. They were assets, variables, units. Dehumanization, he realized too late, was not a side effect, it was a requirement. The most disturbing confession came from a senior administrator who never saw a single experiment firsthand. His crime was distance. He signed approvals, extended budgets, and shielded programs from scrutiny. He spoke calmly in his recorded statement, but near the end his voice broke. "I never touched them," he said, "and that's what I can't forgive."
These confessions forced a reckoning inside the agency that no external investigation ever could. The damage was no longer abstract. It had names, faces, voices. An internal task force was formed quietly, its purpose not to assign blame, but to assess legacy risk. What would happen if this information became public too soon? The answer was unanimous and terrifying. It would fracture the nation. Not because the public could not handle the truth, but because the truth would confirm a fear many already carried, that power, when unchecked, will always sacrifice the vulnerable first. The task force concluded that releasing the file in the near future would not lead to healing. It would lead to polarization, denial, retaliation, and political weaponization. The victims would be used as symbols instead of being honored as human beings. So they turned to the future. Choosing the year was not symbolic, it was mathematical. They calculated generational distance, legal statutes, cultural shifts, psychological resilience. They projected when the emotional charge might cool enough for reason to survive exposure. 2075. By then, the Cold War would be history rather than memory. The architects and enforcers would be gone. The technologies would be outdated. The world might have developed better language for accountability without vengeance. Most importantly, the file would no longer threaten existing power structures. It would threaten ideas instead. The sealing ceremony itself was minimal. No speeches, no photographs, just signatures, biometric locks, and a final instruction embedded into the archive system. Access denied until temporal condition met. Once sealed, the file could not be altered without leaving a trace. That was intentional. Tampering would be detectable. Destruction would be obvious. The truth, whatever it was, would survive intact. For some, sealing the file felt like relief. For others, it felt like cowardice. Outside the agency, the world continued to produce its own darkness. New scandals emerged. New secrets were exposed. Each revelation chipped away at public trust, preparing society slowly for deeper truths. Some historians began noticing an odd pattern. Every major intelligence scandal exposed after 2000 seemed to echo lessons already learned decades earlier. It was as if the sealed file was casting a long shadow, influencing policy indirectly through guilt and restraint. Certain programs were shut down before they began. Certain proposals were rejected without explanation. Ethics boards gained quiet authority. The past, though hidden, was still shaping the present. And yet, for the survivors, time did not heal everything. Some eventually learned fragments of what had been done to them, not through official channels, but through therapy breakthroughs, recovered memories, or chance encounters with others like them. They formed informal networks, support groups without names. They shared experiences without conclusions. Many expressed the same grief, not just for what was taken from them, but for the years they spent believing something was wrong with them. That was the deepest cruelty of all. A few survivors found peace in the idea that the truth was preserved somewhere, that even if they never saw justice, history would, that their suffering would not vanish completely. One survivor, interviewed anonymously in the early 2010s, said something that was later transcribed and added to the file itself. "Don't open it for revenge," he said. "Open it so it doesn't happen again." As the decades passed, a strange tension settled over the archive. The file was untouched, yet alive in consequence. Each year that passed brought humanity closer to the moment of revelation. And with each year, the question grew heavier. Would the future be kinder than the past? Or would it recognize itself too clearly in those pages? The file doesn't wait to accuse. It waits to teach. But lessons are only learned by those willing to look.
As the world moved deeper into the digital age, something unsettling happened. The need for secrecy did not disappear, it changed its shape. Where once experiments required isolated facilities and physical control, influence now traveled through screens, algorithms, and data points. People volunteered their thoughts, fears, and habits freely, never realizing how predictable they had become. The methods were cleaner, the scars were invisible. Inside intelligence circles, veterans of the old programs watched this evolution with mixed emotions. Some felt relief, others felt dread. They recognized the pattern. Control no longer required breaking individuals one by one. It required shaping environments, nudging behavior, amplifying fear, rewarding conformity. The same principles, refined and scaled. The sealed file became a quiet reference point, not opened, but remembered. When proposals emerged involving mass psychological profiling or emotional manipulation through media, senior advisors sometimes shut them down with a single sentence, "We've seen where this leads." No explanation followed, none was needed. Outside, the public debated privacy, freedom, and security without realizing how close those debates came to truths already buried. Whistleblowers revealed fragments, illegal surveillance, data misuse, covert influence campaigns. Each revelation sparked outrage, then exhaustion. People adapted. That adaptability was humanity's strength and its vulnerability. Meanwhile, the survivors aged. Their stories softened at the edges, memories fading, but emotions remaining sharp. Some finally found language for what they had endured. Trauma therapy advanced. Neuroscience acknowledged that prolonged psychological conditioning could permanently alter identity. What once had no name now had many. Yet without official acknowledgement, healing remained incomplete. A small number of researchers began connecting dots across decades, noticing anomalies that could not be explained by policy alone. They found hints of a sealed truth guiding restraint, like an unseen hand steering away from old mistakes. One historian described it as a ghost ethic, a moral boundary shaped by something unseen but deeply feared. As 2075 drew closer, the existence of time-sealed files became less controversial. Society matured in some ways, hardened in others. People became more skeptical of authority, yet more dependent on systems they did not control. The irony was painful. Ethics education expanded, human experimentation laws strengthened, international conventions addressed psychological warfare and cognitive harm. Each advancement felt like an apology written into law. Still, the file remained closed. Inside the archive, nothing changed. The materials aged but did not decay. Voices recorded decades earlier waited without urgency. They had already endured time. A new generation of archivists took over. To them, the file was not guilt, it was responsibility. They were trained to protect it, not from enemies, but from impatience. Some asked quietly what would happen when the date arrived. The answer was always the same: protocol. No ceremony, no spin, just release. The hope was not forgiveness. The hope was understanding. Understanding that fear can make monsters of institutions, that good intentions do not cancel cruelty, that progress without ethics is just repetition with better tools. And perhaps when the file finally opens, the world will see not just what was done, but why it must never be done again. The future approaches slowly, carrying the weight of truth with it. Time does not erase consequences. It only decides who must face them. And somewhere beyond today, the lock will turn. As the calendar pages turn toward the middle of the 21st century, the world grows louder, faster, and more transparent, yet some truths still move at the speed of conscience. The year 2075 no longer feels distant to those who track time in generations instead of headlines. It feels inevitable. By then, the people who designed the experiments will exist only as names in sealed transcripts. The officials who justified them will be reduced to signatures beneath decisions they once defended. The survivors, those who lived long enough, will be remembered through recordings, written testimony, and neurological data that cannot cry but still speaks. The file will finally open not with shock, but with weight. Inside, there will be no aliens, no supernatural revelations, no single villain to blame. What it will reveal instead is far more unsettling. Ordinary people, operating within extraordinary fear, slowly surrendering their humanity, one rational decision at a time. There will be timelines showing how urgency replaced ethics, charts documenting emotional degradation as a measurable outcome, audio recordings where confidence dissolves into doubt, then regret, testimonies where silence speaks louder than screams ever could. The future readers will hear the voices of subjects who tried to explain pain they did not understand. They will hear professionals who convinced themselves that ends justified means, until the ends arrived and meant nothing at all. The most heartbreaking section will not describe suffering, it will describe normalization. Page after page will show how cruelty became routine, how language softened harm, how distance erased responsibility, how good people learned to look away because looking too closely hurt too much. And then there will be the realization that none of this was inevitable, that every step had an exit, every decision had an alternative, every signature could have been refused. This is where karma enters, not as punishment, but as understanding. The future will not be asked to judge the past, it will be asked to recognize itself within it. Because the final pages of the file do not end with condemnation, they end with a warning that power without humility always repeats its mistakes, that secrecy without accountability decays into abuse, that protection without compassion becomes tyranny wearing a flag. When the file opens, the world will grieve, not only for the victims, but for the innocents lost when fear was allowed to lead. And yet there will be a quiet ray of hope. Hope in the fact that the truth was preserved. Hope that someone, long ago, chose delay over destruction. Hope that humanity believed, just enough, that the future might be better than the past. The file does not ask for forgiveness, it asks for remembrance. Because remembering is how cycles break. And when the vault finally unlocks, the sound will not be metal against metal. It will be the echo of a lesson learned too late, yet still in time. If hidden history matters to you, don't look away. Follow this page, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us, because some truths are buried, and we uncover them.